Right now, at this very moment, one of the most active volcanoes on Earth is sitting inside a scientifically predicted window for its next eruption, and the countdown scientists gave the public is already ticking. A countdown built not on guesswork or superstition, but on real-time data pulled directly from instruments buried in the volcano's own summit. Kilauea, the volcano that has been erupting again and again since the very end of 2024, is expected to burst back to life within the next couple of days. And this time researchers aren't just guessing. They're reading the mountain's own heartbeat, using instruments buried in the ground to predict almost exactly when lava will start shooting hundreds of feet into the sky, turning what used to be one of nature's most unpredictable phenomena into something scientists can now circle on a calendar with genuine confidence. This isn't science fiction. This is happening on the big island of Hawaii right now, and the story behind how scientists learned to time an eruption this precisely is honestly one of the wildest ongoing stories in modern volcanology. What started as a single eruption back in 2024 has quietly turned into one of the most closely tracked, most precisely forecast volcanic events anywhere on the planet, and most people outside of Hawaii have barely heard a word about it. Let's start with the basics, because what's happening at Kīlauea right now is genuinely unlike almost anything volcanologists have documented before. Since December 23, 2024, Kīlauea has been erupting episodically from its summit inside a massive crater called Halemaʻumaʻu. Instead of one continuous eruption that drags on for months or years, this volcano has settled into a strange, almost rhythmic pattern, firing off dramatic bursts of lava fountaining that typically last less than 12 hours, followed by pauses that can stretch anywhere from a couple weeks to well over a month, a rhythm unlike almost anything else volcanologists have documented in modern times. Scientists have been counting these individual bursts one by one, and as of this recording, Kīlauea has already produced more than 50 separate eruptive episodes since the very first one kicked off just before Christmas of 2024. To put that in perspective, past eruptions at the same volcano have historically involved slow-moving lava flows that could last anywhere from a few days to multiple decades without pause. This current eruption looks nothing like that older pattern. Instead of one long, continuous event, Kilauea has essentially been breathing, filling and emptying its summit magma chamber. Over and over, each cycle ending in a burst of fountaining lava before the whole process quietly begins again. Here's where it gets genuinely remarkable. Research geophysicists at the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory have gotten so good at reading this volcano's underlying behavior that they're now able to forecast the start of each new episode with startling accuracy, sometimes narrowing the expected window down to just a handful of days. As of the most recent official update, scientists have forecast that the next episode, officially designated Episode 51, is likely to begin within the next couple of days, based entirely on measurements taken deep beneath the surface. Geophysicist Ingrid Johansson, who has led much of this forecasting work, has openly acknowledged just how unusual this entire situation is, describing what her team has witnessed over the past year and a half as genuinely unprecedented in the history of studying this kind of eruption. So how exactly do scientists manage to predict something as violent and unpredictable as a volcanic eruption down to a matter of days? The answer comes down to an instrument that sounds almost deceptively simple, called a tilt meter. Picture a carpenter's level, the kind with a bubble inside a tube that shows you whether a surface is perfectly flat. A tilt meter works on roughly that same basic principle, except instead of measuring a countertop, it measures the ground itself, tracking incredibly subtle shifts in the angle of the Earth's surface with extraordinary precision. Hawaiian Volcano Observatory scientists have actually been using this kind of instrument since 1912, refining the technology generation after generation. And today, they have 4 separate tilt meters positioned around Kilauea's summit region, constantly streaming real-time data back to researchers. Early versions of this instrument, developed by an HVO scientist back in the 1950s, used a metal tube filled with conducting fluid and 2 bubbles, essentially an oversized, ultra-sensitive version of the same level a carpenter might use to hang a picture frame. Modern digital tilt meters have replaced that original design, but the underlying principle driving the science remains exactly the same one used more than a century ago. Here's why that matters so much. Deep beneath Kilauea's summit sits a chamber of molten rock, slowly filling with fresh magma pushing up from deep within the earth. As that magma accumulates, the ground above it physically swells, bulging upward in a process scientists call inflation. A tilt meter can detect that swelling happening in real time, watching the ground tilt further and further as pressure steadily builds beneath the surface. Once that underground pressure finally reaches a critical threshold, the magma chamber essentially can't hold anymore, and it forces its way upward through the volcano's plumbing system, triggering a fresh episode of lava fountaining at the surface. The moment that eruption begins, the chamber starts emptying, and the ground begins tilting back down in what scientists call deflation. The most recent completed episode, numbered 50, played out almost exactly this way, ending abruptly after roughly 7 hours of continuous fountaining from the volcano's north vent, after which the summit fell quiet again and the tilt meters began recording steady. Inflation almost immediately, setting the stage for whatever comes next in this ongoing, unusually predictable cycle. If you're finding this as fascinating as I do, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of science coverage reach more curious minds. What makes Kilauea's current behavior so scientifically valuable is just how consistent this cycle has remained. Johansson and her colleagues have observed that the amount of deflationary tilt recorded during any given eruption episode tends to closely match the amount of inflationary tilt that builds back up during the pause that follows. In other words, the volcano appears to be refilling almost exactly what it just erupted, episode after episode, like clockwork. Interestingly, when the volume of lava erupted during a given episode has been smaller, the refill process tends to speed up correspondingly, which is part of why the gaps between some recent episodes have shrunk to closer to one per week rather than stretching out for a month, since a smaller chamber deficit simply takes less time to refill before pressure builds back to the eruption threshold. Once the tilt climbs back to roughly the same level it was sitting at right before the previous eruption began, scientists know conditions are ripe for the next episode to start. As Johansson put it herself, this isn't necessarily how every episodic eruption behaves elsewhere in the world, and the ability to provide these detailed forecasts really only exists because Kilauea happens to be behaving in this unusually predictable way right now. That predictability doesn't mean every detail is knowable in advance, though. While scientists have gotten remarkably good at forecasting roughly when an episode will begin, predicting exactly how big any individual eruption will be remains far trickier. One especially memorable example came during episode 41, when lava fountaining sent an unexpectedly massive amount of ash and volcanic debris drifting into nearby communities north of the summit, catching both scientists and residents somewhat off guard. The event was serious enough that the National Weather Service issued a dedicated ashfall warning, something HVO scientist in charge Ken Hahn has pointed out may have been among the very first warnings of its kind ever issued anywhere in the country. The timing of an eruption might be predictable. The exact violence and scale of what comes out of the ground once it starts often isn't. And these eruptions, when they do happen, are genuinely spectacular events. During episode 49, one of the more recent fountaining episodes before this recording, lava fountains from the north vent reached heights approaching 700 feet into the air, taller than Seattle's Space Needle standing on end. Lava flows from that single episode covered somewhere between 40 and 50% of the crater floor in just a matter of hours. These aren't small, gentle lava flows creeping slowly across the landscape, the way people sometimes picture a typical Hawaiian eruption. These are violent, towering fountains of molten rock, visible from miles away, capable of reshaping the crater floor in the span of a single afternoon. Scientists on the ground during these episodes have used laser rangefinders just to accurately measure how high individual fountains are climbing in real time, since visual estimates alone simply aren't precise enough for something moving and changing this quickly. The mechanics driving each individual episode follow a strikingly consistent pattern once you understand what to look for. In the hours leading up to a new episode, scientists typically observe a distinct sequence of warning signs building at the summit. Strong. Glow becomes visible at the eruptive vents, signaling that molten material is rising closer and closer to the surface. Spattering, small bursts of lava breaking through the surface without full-scale fountaining yet, begins appearing periodically. Seismic tremor, the rumbling vibration caused by magma and gas moving underground, starts pulsing at increasingly frequent intervals. During the build-up toward one recent episode, scientists documented tremor spikes occurring roughly every 10 to 40 minutes, eventually tightening into a more rapid, cyclic pattern as the eruption drew closer, a pattern researchers describe as gas pistoning, where pressurized gas repeatedly builds and releases just beneath the surface in the hours before a full eruption finally breaks through. During one especially telling build-up period, spatter bursts unusually began emerging from the south vent first, rather than the north vent, which had typically led off in earlier episodes, a small but noteworthy shift that reminded scientists just how much subtle variation can still exist within an otherwise remarkably consistent overall pattern. It's worth being clear about the actual hazards involved here, because the reality is more nuanced than pure spectacle. This entire eruption has been taking place within a closed section of Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, an area that has actually been off limits to the public since late 2007, long before this current eruptive phase ever began. The most dangerous ground, the crater rim surrounding Halemaʻumaʻu itself, is prone to cracking, slumping, and small landslides that can expose molten material underneath, making it extremely hazardous terrain that visitors simply cannot access during active phases. Beyond the immediate crater, the primary hazards facing nearby communities involve volcanic gas and ash fallout rather than direct lava flows reaching populated areas. That gas hazard deserves its own explanation because it's arguably the most persistent danger tied to this entire eruption. Kilauea continuously releases large volumes of volcanic gas during active fountaining, primarily water vapor, carbon dioxide, and sulfur dioxide. That sulfur dioxide reacts with the atmosphere downwind of the eruption to create something known locally as VOG, short for volcanic smog, a hazy, acrid air pollution that can drift for miles depending on wind direction and cause real respiratory problems for people caught in its path. VOG isn't unique to this current eruption either. It's been a recurring feature of life on parts of the Big Island for generations, but the frequency of this episodic eruption has meant nearby communities have had to adapt to living with the possibility of gas exposure on a far more regular basis than they might during a typical single, shorter eruption elsewhere. Alongside the gas, lava fountaining also produces tephra, a broad category of volcanic fragments ranging from fine ash all the way up to strands of natural volcanic glass known as Pele's hair, delicate glass fibers formed as lava stretches and cools in midair before drifting down over the surrounding landscape. Local residents have even been asked to help scientists by reporting where these glassy particles land, turning ordinary members of the community into an informal extension of the volcano's own monitoring network. If this kind of ongoing volcanic science story is exactly what you come here for, make sure you're subscribed because there's a lot more of this coming and you won't want to miss the next update. There's a strange and slightly unsettling detail that emerged during this eruption too, one that has nothing to do with instruments at all. Wildlife biologists studying invasive coqui frogs on the Big Island noticed something remarkable while reviewing surveillance footage from the area. Moments before a magnitude 4.6 earthquake struck near the summit region, the constant, loud chorus of chirping coqui frogs suddenly went completely silent, only for the earthquake to arrive seconds later. Researchers studying the animals believe the frogs may be sensing subtle ground vibrations moments before humans ever feel them. An eerie but genuinely fascinating example of how sensitive some animals appear to be to the earliest signs of seismic activity, sometimes picking up on warning signs that even sophisticated scientific instruments only detect a beat later. Wildlife biologist Raymond McGuire, who has studied the invasive frog species on Hawaii Island for years, described the experience of reviewing that footage as genuinely eerie, noting that the chorus stopping followed almost immediately by ground shaking has become something of a recognizable pattern for anyone who spends enough time listening closely around the summit region. Despite how dramatic and visually stunning this eruption has been, it's important to understand exactly where it sits on the broader spectrum of volcanic danger. Kilauea's current alert level has remained at advisory, with an aviation color code of yellow, categories that indicate ongoing eruptive activity being closely monitored, but not an imminent threat to life or major infrastructure beyond the closed eruption zone itself. This is not building towards some kind of catastrophic, explosive event. Kilauea is what volcanologists classify as a shield volcano, a type generally known for producing relatively fluid, fast-moving lava rather than the violent, ash-choked explosions associated with volcanoes like Mount St. Helens. Shield volcanoes get their name from their broad, gently sloping profile, built up gradually over tens of thousands of years by countless individual lava flows layering on top of one another, rather than growing through the kind of single, explosive cone-building eruptions associated with far more dangerous stratovolcanoes elsewhere in the world. That structural difference is a major reason why, despite the sheer visual drama of towering lava fountains, Kilauea's current activity remains far more predictable and far less globally catastrophic than the kind of eruption most people instinctively picture when they hear the word volcano. The danger here isn't a sudden, unannounced catastrophe. It's a sustained, repeating hazard requiring consistent vigilance precisely because the eruption keeps returning again and again, episode after episode, month after month. That repetition is exactly why the forecasting work being done here matters so much. Because scientists can predict roughly when each episode will begin, park officials and county civil defense agencies have been able to plan around each eruption with real precision, closing hazardous areas ahead of time, positioning monitoring teams appropriately, and issuing timely public guidance about gas and ashfall risks before each new fountaining episode actually begins. Park rangers have been able to time trail closures and staff safety briefings around specific forecast windows rather than reacting blindly after an eruption has already started, a level of operational planning that would have been almost unthinkable during earlier, less predictable eruptive periods in the volcanoes. Long history. That kind of advanced planning simply wouldn't be possible without the kind of detailed ground deformation data scientists have been gathering here for over a century. Looking ahead, researchers openly admit there's genuine uncertainty about how long this current pattern can actually continue. Kilauea has shown no clear signs of winding down this extended period of activity, and scientists are now turning increasing attention toward how the volcano's behavior might eventually shift going forward. At some point, magma could begin traveling toward a different part of the volcanic system entirely, potentially triggering an eruption from an entirely new location, rather than continuing to emerge from the same vents inside. Halemaʻumaʻu. Johansson and her colleagues have been direct about the limits of their own forecasting model too, acknowledging that their ability to predict these episodes so precisely will almost certainly end someday, most likely because the volcano itself eventually starts behaving in some new, less predictable way. For now, though, the pattern holds, and the forecast window scientists have issued for the very next episode is either happening right now or arriving within the next couple of days. Somewhere beneath Halemaʻumaʻu crater, pressure has been quietly building for weeks, and everything the tilt meters are recording points toward another dramatic burst of fountaining lava climbing hundreds of feet. Into the Hawaiian sky, sometime very soon, exactly the way the data said it would. Scientists will be watching every subtle shift in that data closely, ready to update the forecast the moment the ground gives them any new information. And whenever it finally happens, it will mark yet another chapter in what has already become one of the most closely studied, most precisely forecast volcanic eruptions in modern history. A reminder that even something as ancient and untamed as an active volcano can, under the right conditions, start to reveal its own rhythm to the people patient enough to listen for it. For now, all anyone can really do is watch the same tilt meter scientists are watching, trust a forecasting method that has proven itself accurate more than 50 times over, and wait for the ground beneath Halemaʻumaʻu to finally tip past the threshold it's been quietly approaching for days.